The wind came down off the ridge like something with teeth, and by the time it reached the valley floor, it had already stripped the aspens bare and driven every elk herd south of the pass. Two women stood at the mouth of a cave with their arms full of stacked pine, snow already collecting in the folds of their coats, and neither of them said a word about the storm building behind the gray wall of cloud to the north. They had counted the cords already. They had counted the sacks of dried meat and the jars of preserved beans and the tin of matches wrapped twice in oilcloth against the damp. What they had not counted, what no one could have counted, was how many days the mountain intended to keep them there before it decided whether they lived or died. That is the ending. A landlord who thought two women alone could be thrown off his land like stray dogs, and two women who turned his cruelty into a lesson the whole valley would still be repeating come spring. If you want to see exactly how they did it, stay to the end. And if this kind of story is the kind you come back for, hit like and subscribe now, because you are going to want to see how this one closes. 14 days earlier, none of this had happened yet. Odessa Lynn Carraway and her twin sister Bethany stood in the yard of the only home they had ever known, while their landlord, a heavy-set man named Wendell Pruitt, read from a folded paper as though the words on it were scripture instead of an eviction he had drawn up himself. Behind him stood two hired men, arms crossed, faces arranged into the practiced blankness of men who got paid regardless of what they were asked to watch. The house had belonged to their father before consumption took him the previous winter, and the land beneath it had been leased on terms that had seemed fair enough when he was alive to argue them. "The rent is 3 months behind," Pruitt said, not looking up from the paper. "I have been patient on account of your father's memory. I cannot be patient forever." "We have paid what we could," Odessa said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, folded tight in front of her, told a different story to anyone paying close attention. "We asked for time until the spring shearing. You agreed to that in November." "I do not recall agreeing to anything of the kind." "You shook my father's hand on it," Bethany said. "I was standing right there." "Your father is dead," Pruitt said, and there was no cruelty in his voice when he said it, only a flat efficiency that was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. "And I have a paper with my signature and yours, and it says the rent comes due the 1st of every month regardless of season. I am not a charity, ladies. I am a businessman." They were given 2 hours to gather what they could carry, 2 hours to sort 25 years of a life into what mattered and what did not, and Odessa found that grief made poor company for that particular task, because everything mattered and nothing did, all at once, in the same breath. They took blankets, they took their father's rifle and the small store of cartridges he had left behind, though it was Odessa's steady hand and not Bethany's that had ever done the hunting. They took a hatchet, a skillet, 2 knives, a coil of rope, a tin of matches, and every scrap of dried meat and preserved vegetable the cellar still held from the autumn harvest, which was not much, because the harvest had been thin and the winter had come early and hungry. "Where will you go?" one of the hired men asked, not unkindly, as they loaded the last of it onto the single mule Pruitt had, with what he clearly considered generosity, allowed them to keep. "Somewhere he does not own," Bethany said, and there was enough iron in it that the hired man did not ask again. They walked north, away from the small town of Coldwater Bend and its single muddy street, because north was where the mountains rose steep and unclaimed, and because Odessa remembered from summers spent trailing after her father while he checked snares, a cave cut into the base of a granite outcrop where the two of them had once sheltered from a sudden hailstorm when she was perhaps 12 years old. She did not know if it still stood open. She did not know if some bear had claimed it in the years since. She knew only that it was the one shelter within walking distance that no man's signature could take from them. And that fact alone made the long, cold walk feel less like defeat and more like the first decision they had been allowed to make for themselves in longer than either of them cared to admit. The cave, when they found it after 6 hours of walking with their breath fogging white and their fingers gone numb inside their gloves, was smaller than Odessa remembered, but dry and deep enough that a fire built near the mouth would not be extinguished by wind coming off the ridge. Bethany stood at the entrance for a long moment, looking back the way they had come, toward a valley now hidden behind a fold of hills, toward a house that belonged to someone else now, toward a life that had ended that morning without either of them choosing it. "We are not going to die out here," she said, and it was not a question, though it needed an answer all the same. "No," Odessa said, "we are not." Their father, Amos Carraway, had not been a wealthy man, but he had been a careful one, and careful men left behind more than land and debts. He had left behind, in the daughters he raised after their mother's death when the twins were still small, a habit of mind that treated the wilderness as a problem to be solved rather than a force to be feared. Odessa remembered him kneeling beside a creek once, showing her how to read the direction of a coming storm by the way the birds went quiet and the air went still before it, how a mountain would warn you if you knew how to listen. "Waste nothing you can use twice," he used to say. "Count everything you have before you need it, not after. Comfort is a debt the wilderness always collects with interest." She had thought, at the time, that these were the ordinary sayings of an ordinary man. She understood now, kneeling at the mouth of a cold cave with her twin sister and a single mule, and the last of the daylight fading fast behind gray cloud, that he had been preparing her for exactly this moment without either of them knowing it. The first 3 days were consumed entirely by the discipline of inventory and construction. They cleared the cave floor of loose stone and old leaves, laid down a bed of dry pine boughs against the chill rising up from the granite beneath them, and built a fire ring just inside the entrance where the smoke could draw out through a natural chimney crack in the rock above. Bethany, who had always been the quicker hand with a needle and thread, patched what tears she could find in their coats and blankets, while Odessa took the hatchet and the rifle and began the long, cold work of building a store of food and fuel that might, if the winter proved merciful, carry them through to spring. She counted every cord of wood as she stacked it. 40 pieces the first day, split from a fallen deadfall a quarter-mile down slope, and dragged back on a sled improvised from lashed branches. 60 the second, as her arms grew stronger to the work, and her hands grew harder against the cold wood. She counted every trap she set along the frozen creek bed. 6 the first week, 8 by the second, checking each one at dawn before the light was fully up, because a trapped rabbit left too long belonged to the foxes and not to 2 hungry women. Not wild, not panicked, exact. That was the only way to survive a season like this one. Panic wasted daylight, and daylight was the one thing the mountain would not sell back to them at any price. Bethany managed what fell inside the cave, while Odessa managed what lay beyond it. She rationed the dried meat into portions measured by the width of her palm, and she kept a tally of the days scratched in charcoal along the smooth granite wall just inside the entrance. A mark for every sunrise, a habit that gave the passage of time a shape it would not otherwise have had in a place where the light came thin and gray through the same unchanging cloud for days at a stretch. "How many days do you think we need to store for?" Bethany asked one evening, watching the tally grow by the light of the fire. "However many the mountain decides to give us," Odessa said. "We store for the worst one, not the easiest one. Papa always said that." "Papa is not the one out here freezing." "No," Odessa agreed, allowing herself the smallest smile. "But he is the reason we know how not to." By the end of the second week, they had accumulated what Odessa judged to be a workable margin. 200 pieces of split wood stacked along the cave's inner wall, dry and ready. A smoked haunch of venison, taken from a young buck she had tracked for 2 days before finally bringing it down with a single clean shot that had made her hands shake afterward. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of knowing that shot had to count, because a wasted cartridge was a cartridge they did not have to spare. Dried rabbit meat, strips of it hung from a line strung across the cave ceiling. A store of pine nuts gathered before the last of the cones had frozen shut. Melted snow boiled for drinking water, stored in every container they had carried from the house. It was not abundance, it was survival, calculated to the ounce and the hour, and Odessa found a strange, fierce pride in watching the store grow, as though every stacked log and every strip of dried meat was a small act of defiance against a man who had assumed 2 women alone would simply lie down and disappear. It was on the 16th night, with the tally on the wall reading 16 careful marks, that the mountain gave its first true warning. Odessa woke before dawn to a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. No wind, no creak of branches, no distant call of the owls that had nested somewhere above the cave since their first week there. She stepped to the entrance and found the sky gone a strange, flat white, the kind of sky her father had once called a held fist, a sky that meant a storm was gathering strength before it struck, rather than announcing itself gradually the way ordinary weather did. "Something is coming," she told Bethany, shaking her sister's shoulder gently. "Big. We need to reinforce." They spent the day building a second wall of stacked stone and packed snow just inside the cave mouth, leaving only a narrow gap for smoke and air, and moving every scrap of stored wood and food deeper into the chamber where the wind, whatever it decided to bring, could not reach it directly. Odessa's hands were raw and cracked by the time the light began to fail, and Bethany's lips had gone pale with cold and exhaustion, but the store was secure, and the wall was solid, and there was nothing left to do but wait for whatever the flat white sky had been promising all day. The blizzard struck 2 hours after full dark, and it struck with a violence that made every careful preparation feel, for one terrible hour, entirely insufficient. Wind screamed through the narrow gap in their stone wall with a sound like something alive and furious, and the temperature inside the cave dropped hard enough that both sisters huddled together beneath every blanket they owned, feeding the fire in small, careful increments because burning it too fast meant running out before the storm exhausted itself, and burning it too slow meant risking the cold finding them in their sleep. "Talk to me," Bethany said, her voice small in a way Odessa had not heard since they were children. "Tell me something. Anything." "Papa used to say a mountain never kills a person who respects it," Odessa said, feeding a single measured piece of wood into the flame. "Only the ones who think they know better than the weather." "Do you believe that?" "I believe we built a good wall. I believe we counted right. That is all the believing I have room for tonight." Somewhere near the deepest hour of that first terrible night, exhaustion pulled Odessa down into a sleep thin and restless. And in it, or perhaps not entirely in it, she found herself standing in a warmth that had no business existing inside a blizzard. Her father, seated across a fire that cast no smoke, his face exactly as she remembered it, before the sickness had hollowed his cheeks. "You could rest here," he said, and his voice carried none of the harshness of the wind outside, only a terrible, gentle comfort. "You have done enough, Odessa. No one would fault you for resting now." "Bethany needs me." "Bethany will manage. She always does." He smiled, and it was her father's smile exactly, and something in her chest ached at the sight of it. "Rest, Odessa. You have carried enough." She understood, even within the dream, exactly what was being offered to her, and exactly what it would cost to accept it. And she found her feet already turning away from that gentle, false fire before her waking mind had fully caught up to the decision. "No," she said, and the word came out of her sleeping mouth as a real sound, rough and certain. "Not yet." She woke with her heart hammering and the fire nearly out, and Bethany shaking her shoulder in genuine alarm, and it took her a long moment in the gray pre-dawn light to separate the dream from the waking world, though the lesson of it stayed with her long after the details had begun to blur. The mountain did not just test the body, it tested the will to keep choosing to live, hour after freezing hour. And Odessa understood now, in a way she had not fully understood before that night, exactly why her father had drilled discipline into her with such quiet insistence. Discipline was not about comfort. It was about having something solid to hold on to when the mind itself began looking for reasons to let go. The blizzard raged for 3 full days before it finally exhausted itself, and when the two sisters finally dug their way out through a drift that had piled higher than Odessa's shoulder against the cave's stone wall, they found a world transformed into unbroken white silence. The valley below buried deep, the pine boughs bowed low under the accumulated weight. Their store of wood had held, their store of food had held. They had lost nothing but sleep and a measure of skin from their cracked and reddened hands. And standing there in the blinding new light, Odessa felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the morning Pruitt had read his eviction notice in their yard. "We are still here," Bethany said, and there was wonder in it, and something harder, too, something that had not existed in her voice 2 weeks earlier. "We are still here," Odessa agreed, "and when the thaw comes, we are going back." The remainder of that winter passed in a rhythm the sisters came to understand fully only in hindsight, a slow accumulation of small, mastered dangers that built, day by day, into something like confidence. There was the week the traps came up empty 3 days running, and Odessa was forced to range farther than she liked, tracking a deer trail nearly 2 miles from the cave before finally finding fresh sign worth following. There was the afternoon Bethany slipped on ice hauling water from the creek and wrenched her ankle badly enough that she could not walk on it for 4 days, during which Odessa managed the wood and the traps and the water alone, falling into bed each night with her whole body aching in ways she had not known a body could ache, and rising each morning anyway, because the alternative was letting the fire die. There was the night they heard something large moving just beyond the reinforced wall, breathing heavy in the dark, and sat in silence with the rifle between them until the sound finally moved on. Never identified, never spoken of again, except in the charcoal tally that marked it with a small cross beside the day's line, a private code between them for the nights that had asked more of their nerve than any other. By the time the snow began its slow retreat down the mountainside, Odessa's face had thinned to sharp new angles, her cheekbones standing out where softness had once lived, her coat hanging looser on a frame worked lean and hard by 2 months of relentless physical labor. Bethany had changed too, though differently, the softness in her gone quiet and replaced by something watchful, a woman who no longer flinched at the sound of wind against stone. They caught their reflections once, together, in the still black water of a thawing pool, 2 faces that shared the same bones but wore, now, an expression neither of them recognized from before that winter, something forged rather than simply lived. "We look like different people," Bethany said, studying the water. "We are different people," Odessa said. "I am not sure I want to go back to being the one who stood quiet in that yard." "Then do not." It was during the final weeks of that long winter, while checking a trap line farther upslope than she had ever ranged before, that Odessa found the thing that would end up mattering more than any store of wood or dried meat. Tucked into a crevice beneath an overhang, protected from weather by pure accident of geography, she found a rusted strongbox, clearly abandoned long before their arrival, its lock long since given way to rust and time. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, she found a bundle of papers, land surveys and old correspondence bearing the name of a prospector who had, according to the dates on the letters, died alone in these mountains some 15 years before either sister was born. Among the papers, faded but legible, was a filed claim, an original deed to a parcel of mountain land that included, according to the boundary markers described in painstaking legal language, the very valley in which their father's leased house had stood, and the surrounding acreage Pruitt had spent years quietly claiming as his own, under increasingly questionable paperwork filed with a county clerk more interested in Pruitt's friendship than in the truth. Odessa sat with those papers for a long time in the cold, reading them twice to be certain she understood what she was holding. And when she finally returned to the cave that evening, her hands trembled with something that was not the cold. "Bethany," she said, "I think we just found the thing that ends him." They spent the last weeks of that winter cross-referencing every detail of the old claim against what little documentation their father had kept of his own lease agreement. And the picture that emerged, slow and damning, was this. Wendell Pruitt did not hold clear title to the land he had evicted them from. He never had. The original claim, filed decades earlier by a prospector who had died without heirs, had never been properly voided or transferred. And Pruitt's own deed, when Odessa finally studied a copy of it, borrowed quietly from a sympathetic clerk's assistant in town the following spring, contained a boundary description that simply did not match the land he had spent years pretending to own outright. He had built an empire of leased homes and collected rents on land that was not, by any lawful measure, entirely his to lease. When the thaw finally opened the mountain passes enough for safe travel, the twin sisters walked back into Coldwater Bend for the first time in 3 months. And the town that greeted them was not the town that had watched them leave. Word of 2 women surviving an entire mountain winter alone had traveled faster than they had, carried by trappers and traders who had crossed their trail line and marveled at the size of the store they had built. And the sisters who walked back down that muddy main street were regarded with something between disbelief and quiet awe by people who had, 3 months earlier, assumed they would simply vanish into the cold and be forgotten. They went first to the county courthouse, where a circuit judge named Horace Whitfield, a man known through the territory for a stubborn insistence on paperwork over reputation, happened to be presiding over his semi-annual visit to Coldwater Bend. Odessa laid the old prospector's claim on his desk along with a careful handwritten account of every discrepancy she had found in Pruitt's own filed deed, and Whitfield, reading through the documents with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who had seen every trick a small-town land baron could attempt, finally looked up with an expression that told her everything before he spoke a single word. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In a crevice on the mountain, sir, left behind by a man who died with no one to claim it after him." "You understand what this means, if it holds up." "I understand it means Wendell Pruitt evicted 2 women from land he never lawfully owned," Odessa said, and there was no triumph in her voice, only the flat certainty of a fact laid plain. "I understand it means every rent he has collected on that valley for years belongs, by law, to whoever holds proper claim. And I understand that claim, so far as anyone living can prove, now belongs to my sister and myself, as the only people who have filed to formalize it." Whitfield summoned Pruitt to his chambers the following morning, and the confrontation that followed was, by every account, later repeated around the stove at the general store, considerably shorter than Pruitt's usual manner would have suggested. He blustered. He produced his own paperwork, aged and confident, and watched Whitfield set it beside the older claim and note, in a voice gone very quiet, that the boundary markers described in Pruitt's own deed did not, in fact, match the land he had been collecting rent on for the better part of a decade, a discrepancy that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate fraud in the original filing. And Whitfield, it was clear from his tone, did not believe Pruitt capable of the kind of incompetence that would explain it innocently. "You are going to want a lawyer," Whitfield said, "a good one, because as it stands, every dollar of rent you have collected from that valley for the past 6 years is going to be a very interesting subject for a civil court, and I imagine the county attorney will have opinions of his own about criminal filing fraud once he reviews these documents." Pruitt looked in that moment
considerably smaller than he had standing in the caraway yard 3 months earlier with his folded eviction paper and his 2 hired men. And Odessa found that the satisfaction she had expected to feel arrived quieter than she imagined, less like triumph and more like the settling of a debt long overdue.
The legal proceedings that followed occupied much of that spring and summer, and in the end, Pruitt's claim to the valley was voided entirely. His years of collected rents subjected to a court order requiring partial restitution to every family he had wrongfully evicted or overcharged under the fraudulent deed. And the original land, by the plainest reading of law the circuit court could apply, passed to the sisters who had found the proof buried beneath a mountain overhang and had the discipline to survive long enough to bring it home. They rebuilt the house that summer, working alongside 2 hired hands they paid honestly and on time, and by the time the first frost came again, the valley belonged to them in a way it had never quite belonged to their father. Not through inheritance or lease, but through a winter of discipline and a spring of quiet, evidence-driven justice. Odessa kept the charcoal tally from the cave wall, copied carefully into a small notebook before the weather could erase it. 62 marks in total. 62 days that had asked more of her than anything before or since. And some evenings, sitting on the porch of the rebuilt house with Bethany beside her, she would take that notebook out and simply look at the numbers, a reminder that everything worth having in that valley had been paid for in full, in cold and discipline, and the refusal to let go when a false and gentle voice had once told her she had already carried enough. What would you have done, cast out into a mountain winter with nothing but what you could carry? Would you have found the discipline these 2 sisters found? Or would the cold have found you first? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story kept you until the very end, make sure you like and subscribe for more, because there are plenty more stories like this one still to come.